ever feel like you want to be better prepared for emergencies, but aren't sure where to start or how to find the time with all of your other responsibilities? We hear you, and that's where Preparedness in Your Pocket comes in. This podcast is your portable solution for accessible emergency preparedness education. Our episodes are pocket-sized yet packed with important preparedness information, making them easy to digest and learn from wherever you are. Preparedness in Your Pocket is brought to you by the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network, a dedicated communications network providing no-cost emergency preparedness education, training, and resources to home and community-based professionals, patients, and their caregivers. My name is Kendal Lee, and I am the EPN's Program Administrator and your host. On behalf of the EPN, we invite you to make this podcast an essential part of your preparedness toolkit. Just like keeping your keys and wallets close, think of this podcast as your preparedness partner, on the go, always ready to support you with valuable emergency preparedness tips. Join us as we empower you to be better prepared for emergencies, one podcast at a time. Welcome back to another episode of Preparedness in Your Pocket. I'm your host, Kendal Lee, and I'm so glad to have you here with us today. In our first few episodes, we spoke with experts about emergency alerts and warnings, how to recognize them, and what actions to take. Today, we're taking it a step further and talking about how to create a communications plan. When the unexpected happens, our first instinct is usually to check in with our loved ones. But what if you don't have access to a phone, or the usual ways of reaching out aren't available? That's where a communications plan comes in. This type of plan isn't just for major disasters like hurricanes. It's also for smaller events too, like a power outage or getting separated in a crowd. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what a communications plan is and how it's different from other emergency plans, why having a plan matters, even for everyday disruptions, situations where a communications plan can make all the difference, what key information you should include in your plan, and lastly, how to get started building a simple, personalized communication plan for you and your loved ones. And who better to guide us through than our special guest and communications expert, Jorge Castillo. Jorge serves as the chief spokesperson and branch manager for communications and outreach at the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, otherwise known as MDEM for short. He has worked tirelessly to expand MDEM's communication reach, building the largest digital following of any state department in Maryland. He's a nationally and internationally recognized speaker and has shared his expertise at institutions like Towson University, Loyola University in Maryland, and NYU. Jorge, welcome back. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Hey, Kendall, good to see you. Good to talk to you. And I think I might be a little bit more excited than you, if I may say so, because this is a very important topic. Very, very, very important topic, and something that we don't think about until it happens. And then we wish that we had discussed this in advance. So I'm thrilled that you invited me again to your podcast and ready to talk to you and have some fun.
It's such a joy and such a pleasure to have you back again. And for those of you listening, you cannot see us, but we are all smiling and so excited to dive right in. As for our listeners, we're so grateful to have you here with us as well from wherever you're listening. As your preparedness partner, it's so important to remember that we, both of us, Jorge and myself, are seated at the table with you in this conversation and in every conversation that we have here on the podcast. So with that said, it feels important to stress here that, again, Jorge and I both serve in emergency preparedness roles, but communication plans aren't just for professionals. They're truly for everyone. And we're excited to help guide you today in building a communications plan that's just right for you and those you love. So, Jorge, to start us off, I'd love for you to share with our listeners what a communications plan is and how it's different from other emergency plans. For example, an evacuation plan.
Absolutely, Kendall. And I think the theme for today is to keep things simple. When we talk about a plan, a lot of people think of probably the worst case scenario of planning things and them not going the way they did and how much time they spend. This is going to be talking about making it simple. A communications plan is really all about connection, right? It's about connection and connecting the dots, making sure that in an emergency, as you said, whether it's big or small, whether it's a natural disaster or a power outage, you and your loved ones know exactly what to do. So you have a clear and reliable way to reach one another, or at least to find the information on how to reach one
Mm-hmm.
another, because sometimes you are not going to be able to reach one another with your cell phone, let's say, for example, so it's about that connection. What do you do to stay connected and remain connected? The second part of your question is how does it relate to an evacuation plan? Again, keeping it simple, an evacuation plan is very, very, very complicated. It deals a lot more with the physicality of things, right? How do we move 1.5 million people from the Delmarva coast out of harm's way when a tropical cyclone is approaching Maryland, Delaware, or Virginia. Whereas a communications plan really focuses on how we can stay informed and connected, who to call, where to
Mm-hmm.
meet, what to do if the cell phone service is down, what to do if the cell phone service is overwhelmed. Like it may be working, but it's overwhelmed and you can't get
Mm-hmm.
through. We'll talk about that a little bit later too, and some of the questions that we're going to address today. And it also complements all your other emergency planning by making sure that you're not left in the dark, literally or emotionally, when
Mm-hmm.
something goes wrong. So that's really the difference. A communications plan is about connection. It's simple. Questions to ponder when you think about a communications plan, right? When internet and wireless services are not accessible, how will you communicate? Do you have landlines available? Do you have two-way radios like walkie-talkies? I grew up, now I'm going to give my age away, but that's fine, in the 80s where walkie-talkies were a toy, right?
I had
And of course,
walkie-talkies too.
there were professionals who used them, but for me, it was a toy. But it's another tool in your kit to have a walkie-talkie, at least to think about that. If these services are not available and you have no way to communicate, the other part of questions to ask is how will you meet your family and where? Is it going to be at home? Is it going to be at school? Is it going to be a place of work? Who's going to pick up the kids? Who's going to pick up the pets? Right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the kids may be at school, the pets may be at home. So all those things come into play. And once we go down the list, you'll see that it is simpler than you may have thought.
Thank you for sharing that. I just jotted down a quote that I love that you said, a communications plan is about connection and connecting the dots. I think that is such an
Yep.
important takeaway for our listeners. And so now that we understand what a communications plan is, let's explore its value a little bit more. So could you share with our listeners why having a communications plan is such an important part of preparedness?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, to put it simply, it turns chaos into clarity and it gives each person a role to play in staying safe and informed. So you're basically creating the script of a play in advance and you're controlling the actors and you're controlling the set lighting and you're controlling what everybody is going to do and you have it written down so that everybody knows what to do when this thing happens. That's why it's such an important part of preparedness. When bad things happen, right, we tend to think of communications immediately. We want to call to make sure things are all right, people are all right, our loved ones are doing well. But emergencies don't always wait for ideal conditions. So again, cell towers may be overwhelmed, power may be out, you might be separated from your family at an event, at a large event, especially, or at a grocery store, right? That happens on a yearly basis here in the United States. People get separated from their kids at grocery stores, right? You all hear Mr. Blah blah blah, please report to the
The
security
front.
office. That's also part of why this is an important part of preparedness. So again, turns chaos into clarity, gives you peace of mind because everybody knows exactly what to do, even if and even when you cannot reach one another right away.
Another quotable moment from Jorge. You said it turns chaos into clarity. So, having a communications plan, it's about that connection, connecting the dots, and why that's important is because it can turn chaos into clarity.
Exactly.
So I'm going to
Yeah.
recap this again just a little bit. So a family communications plan is a tool that allows everyone to know what to do and where to go when the unexpected happens.
Mhm.
By creating this proactive plan, you can stay connected with those you love when it matters most. Jorge, I particularly loved when you alluded to this metaphor about a play. And when I think about preparedness, I think about how important it is to rehearse, to
Yes.
practice
Yeah.
what you would do in the event something were to take place that was emergent. And so the image or the metaphor of a play, I think is so applicable here. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, and that's an important thing that I think we'll
We're
get
gonna
to a little bit
we're gonna
later
get
is
to.
the practicing of it, right? Because you
Yes.
can write the best play possible, but
But
if
if you
you
don't
get
rehearse your lines, if
exactly,
you don't
you
show
can't
up for rehearsals, right?
absolutely,
What will you
absolutely. So,
do?
yep.
I love that. I'm going to pin that for later. Preparedness at play. Okay, so speaking of when it matters most, Jorge, could you share different scenarios or the type of situations where having a plan can make a real difference? You've touched on some of them before, but how likely these
Hmm.
emergencies were to happen. So you had mentioned bigger things, right? When there's a power outage or inaccessibility to phone lines, but it
Hmm.
could be simple as your phone died, right? It's as big or as small as having a disruption and connecting to those you love for any reason, whether it's
Yep.
big or small. So I'd love for you to just chat about a few scenarios on when having a communications plan would be helpful.
Yep, it can be a big event, like you said, but chances are it's probably going to be a smaller event, separated a crowded event or a power outage that knocks out your Wi-Fi, or let's say you're in a car accident when your phone dies. By the way, I was in a small, very, very small, tiny fender bender last week,
Yep.
and what if your phone died?
I'm glad
You
you're
know,
okay.
thank you,
Yes.
but that's why you have a phone charger in your car, right? But there are folks out there, and I know who you are, who don't have a phone charger there. So, but maybe this is time to think about that. What if I get into a car accident and my phone has died? It's going to happen to somebody, and let's make it so it doesn't happen to you. So it could be a flood, it could be a transportation event, it could be something big or something small. A couple examples, I don't know if you remember last February 2024, there was a widespread outage in the United States, a cellular outage. It lasted for about 13 hours or so, and my question for your listeners is, do you remember that event? How did you communicate during that time? Now, this was only cellular, so you still had email, you had other ways, but these things, make you pause and think about. Those who had a communications plan in place, were you happy that you did? How did you fare? Did you fare well? I bet you fared well than those that didn't have a way to communicate. And they were in a situation where the only thing they could use to communicate was a cell phone. Think about those things. And the more you think about it and the more you start thinking of, oh, okay, maybe this is something that I should consider. Another example of a non-disaster situation, a family gets separated at a public event. It's a parade, it's a festival, it's a fair. Maybe it's the 4th of July. You're at a parade, you get separated from your
Hmm.
child. Cell service is spotty because everybody there is using their phone, they're taking pictures, they're uploading,
Hmm.
you know. It's like being at a stadium, right?
Yeah.
Cell phone is not that reliable because everybody's on social media posting pictures. I'm sure you all have experienced a little bit of that. But because you've practiced your plan, because you know your script in the play and the role you play and the role each of the family members plays, your child knows immediately to go to the information tent and ask for help. Because when you came in, you
Hmm.
said, hey, Tommy, remember what we practice at home. This is where you come to in case we get separated. If you don't know how to get here, you ask a person that looks like this, and maybe you point out a security officer, and that child knows to ask those trusted people how to get to the tent so that then they can ask what to do. Another example could be an emergency at school. There's a lockdown, there's an early
Hmm.
dismissal, the phones are jammed again because everybody's trying to call in, but your family plan outlines exactly who's going to pick up the kids in case this happens, right? So it might be a Tuesday. Like, for example, today I pick up my kid from school, right?
Hmm.
But in the plan, there is one person that will pick up the kid in case of an emergency, and that should be followed and respected, right? So I will defer to that emergency plan if there's a lockdown and allow, you know, the person who's designed to pick up the kid in case of an emergency, which could be somebody who actually doesn't even live within 10 miles of you. That person may be somebody who lives 15, 20 miles, but you have designated
Hmm.
as that emergency pickup contact. And so all of these things are examples of things that can happen. One thing that I would like to add, because I was actually just doing a little bit of refreshing before our meeting today. And, since 1950, guess how many tornadoes Maryland has experienced?
Am I allowed to guess a range?
Yes, let's say it's more
Since
than 100 and less than 1,000.
it's definitely less than 1,000.
You're right.
But if it's from 1950 until today, I would say it could be more than 100 if it's been the last 50 years. I feel like
You're
it's more
correct.
than 100.
It's definitely more than 100. It's 425. And I know that's going to sound like a lot of tornadoes, and it is, especially for Marylanders, right? But yeah, 425 tornadoes. So that's an average of about four per year. Last year, we saw 12 tornadoes, but let's
Hmm.
say 1996, there were 20 tornadoes in Maryland.
Mm.
And so what happens if a tornado touches down near your neighborhood? And no damage to your house, but the power lines are down. Everybody's trying to get in touch with their loved ones, right? Which is what people do during an emergency or a disaster. And you can't get through. But if you have your plan in place, your family knows to send a text, let's say, instead
Hmm.
of trying to call, right? Or if you can find a Wi-Fi service, or if you've practiced to go to the nearest school or to the nearest library and use that Wi-Fi that might still be working. You've identified, again, a relative that lives out of state. That's your call contact. And so all the
Hmm.
family members are calling that person because I may not be able to get to you who is
Right.
10 miles away because of the way the cell phone towers work and the overload that being experienced at that moment. But I may be able to get in touch with my cousin who lives in Pennsylvania, let's say. And
Hmm.
I get in touch with that person, my kid gets in touch with that person, my wife gets in touch with that person, and now we are connecting the dots again.
Again, it's about that connection and connecting the dots. And I think what you're speaking to is the importance of community, which we
Yes.
will touch on again. The takeaway is for myself, but for our listeners, I would love everyone to think about what are the means or the tools or the routes that we use for communication. I immediately think of a phone. That's usually our primary source of communication. If you do not have access to a phone, what is your next accessible resource? Is that email? Is that social media? When we're talking about a communications plan, whether the event is large and emergent or smaller, either way, if you do not have access to the usual means that you would communicate, what would you do? Something I think that's important to think through, or using that metaphor as a play, like rehearse and practice that in
Mhm.
any of these given situations, whether they are common, uncommon, what would you do to stay connected to those that you love? And how would you do that? Which
Exactly.
brings us to, I think, our next part. So, thank you, Jorge. I think
Mhm.
hearing those examples demonstrate how many different situations truly can call for a communications plan. Again, whether
Yeah.
big or small. And so now that we know the why in terms of how important it is to have a communications plan and when it could be needed, I'd love to talk about how to put one together. So could you
Mhm.
walk us through the key components, or in other words, what should be included in a communications plan in order for it to be effective as it can be?
Keeping it simple. So start with contact information. Have a printed list of key phone numbers and key people, including an out of area contact. This is important because
Yes.
local networks do get jammed. So you want to make sure that this person is not in your immediate area and somebody who you trust or a family member. Next, choose a family meeting place. And again, one that is nearby and another one that is outside of your neighborhood. Because you don't know where you're going to be. Then decide how you're going to get updates, whether it's a trusted news station, a text alert system like MD Ready, a NOAA weather radio. Just put that in the plan. This is how we are going to receive updates on the situation, because again, power may not be working, so you may not have access to a TV, but your cell phone is probably working and you may
Mm-hmm.
receive text alerts. There's so many variables, so many things that can affect the condition of the
Mm-hmm.
particular emergency that you just want to think them all through. And lastly, make sure that each person knows the plan. Again, practice, 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 right? Practice it with the kids, check in with older adults. The plan is only going to be helpful if everyone understands it. What I would say the top four things that a strong family communications plan includes is, again, establishing the meeting points, number one. Number two, identifying out of area contacts. And again, somebody outside of the local area to be a central point of contact. Emergency contact cards. And this is important that they're actually written down and printed. You want to have that also digitally because you at times will be able to access them digitally, but you also want to have them printed and
Mm-hmm.
in your wallet, and you print them and your kid takes it to school and everybody has these contact informations. Not many people remember their spouse's cell phone numbers
Mm-hmm.
or even their best friend's cell phone numbers. For those of you who do, I still recommend that you write those down because when you are stressed and in an emergency, you're not going to be able to recall those things. So
Mm-hmm.
you want to make things easier for you. And then you practice all these different communication methods. So if your kid has never sent an email before, maybe it's a good time to learn. Maybe that kid does not have an email address, but they can find a way to send an email or find an adult that will send them an email or at least give them access. Those four things I think make a strong communications plan.
I really appreciate you sharing that and simplifying it to four key components because, as you mentioned earlier, no matter the situation, those are the top four things that you would need to consider or should be included when you're thinking of a communications plan, whether that be getting separated at an event versus preparing for a tornado, etc. Your plan needs to be, I think, flexible and adaptable to the
Exactly. Yeah.
current situation. But
Hmm.
those four things are the key components that no matter the situation must be
Yeah.
present to carry you through. So thank you again for sharing those key components. At the
Hmm.
beginning of this episode, we talked about helping you customize a communications plan that's just right for you and those you love. And I think that connects to something that's so important for us here at the EPN, and I know is important to MDEM as well. Making preparedness inclusive and
Yes.
accessible to everyone. A communications plan shouldn't be a one size fits all, as we've just mentioned. It should be tailored to you and your unique needs and the needs of those that you love. And so I'm reminded of the old fable Goldilocks, who tried porridge and the porridge was either too hot or too cold until she
Yeah.
found, you know, what was just right for her. And so, like that Goldilocks story, you want your plan to be not too simple, but not
Right.
too complicated that it can't be applied, but rather just right. So I think it fits those unique needs again of yourself and
Yep.
those that you love. So Jorge, could you guide us through then for our listeners what they should be thinking about when it comes to customizing their communication plan to meet their needs?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love the Goldilocks analogy because it is right on point. And actually, you can take it a little bit further, right? The Goldilocks,
Uh-huh.
eating the porridge, eating food, right?
Uh-huh.
Not everybody can eat the same food. People react differently to different things. Some people are allergic to things. Some people have gluten allergies. Some people have peanut allergies. So, you're right. You design your menu based on your family's needs. And the same thing applies here.
Mm,
So no two households are the same. You take the general idea, now that we've talked about, the four basic points and everything that should be included, and then you customize it to your needs. So example, you have a family of four. You have two kids, one of whom has autism, for example.
hmm
And this kid, let's call him Johnny. Johnny uses a tablet to communicate, right? So in your plan, you include a printed visual card that uses symbols to explain where to go, who to talk to, and what to do if mom and dad are not nearby. In this example, you've also programmed the tablet so that there are key phrases already inserted into the tablet, and you make sure that Johnny's school and the neighbors are also aware of the plan. That's a good example of a customization that you do based on your family needs. A couple things to think about when you're customizing this: language, right? And language is not just Spanish and Korean and Chinese or Russian. It is sign language, visual language, it can be
Mhm.
Braille as well. If you're writing the plan and it's not understandable by some of your family members, then you need to address that with the language so that people can understand it. Abilities, are there hearing, mobility, or developmental needs that require assistive devices or different modes of communication? In my example, I mentioned a tablet that was pre-programmed with some language and some visual cues. But depending on the person, you want to address that as well. Technology access. Again, cell phones are reliable when they are reliable, but when they do not work, they're useless, right? Also, what if the battery dies? We talked about that,
Right.
being in a car accident without your battery. Include printed cards or memorize that information. But if possible, definitely include the printed material. Again, trusted contacts, we've talked about that before, and schedules. Think about the schedules as you're customizing that because, again, no two plants are going to be the same, right? No two households have exactly the same schedule. There are some people who work the overnight shift, right? Or maybe they work, you know, 3 p.m. to 12 a.m. It
Hmm.
doesn't matter. Your plan should account for those things, not just when you're all together at, let's say, 8 p.m. at night. And lastly, your plan should feel real. It should really
Mm.
feel like something that you understand and that you're happy with and that that you can realistically execute. If it doesn't feel real, chances are that it's too complicated. And again, simple, simple, simple. When you're looking at the plan, you have to own it and it has to feel real. Otherwise, it's just going to be, in a binder or somewhere just collecting dust and not being used.
I appreciate you sharing that. I jotted a few things down as you were talking. And a few things that were coming up for me was first going back to the beginning of the conversation with the Goldilocks metaphor. And I love what you said is that we can take that metaphor one step further. We all must nourish ourselves. That is our
Mhm.
sustenance. But the means in which we do that, the ways and how, the methods, etc., even the preferences are different for everyone, whether that be culturally, whether that be those of us that have different means of receiving nutrition. And so that was really moving to me. I think what we have in common is that all of us have to nourish ourselves in order to sustain, but the ways in which we do that are unique to our preferences, are unique to our unique needs, but similar to that of a communications plan that all of us, in order to stay safe, need to have processes put in place like a communications plan to be able to do that. But there are differences in those plans and what that would look like for each of us. The concept of affirmations was coming up for me when you said it needs to feel real. And something a mentor shared with
Mhm.
me some time ago is that the concept of speaking words of affirmation to yourself, like
Yeah,
you can do it, etc. She had shared with me that words of affirmation have to be authentic to you. The message has to feel authentic to you, or you will not be able to apply it.
exactly. Yep.
And so I think a communications plan has to be authentic to what you would need in
Yep.
order to stay connected to those you love, in order to remain safe. What would you, as a listener, need to consider? What would need to be present in your plan in order for you to remain safe?
Yeah.
What are those things?
Just the mere fact that you plan this communications approach gives you peace of mind so that when something does happen, you're actually less stressed and you can deal with the situation much better. Another example is pilots. Not only do you have the checklist for takeoff, you also practice for emergencies and you have a plan for emergencies. And the fact that you know what you're going to do if an engine goes out or if your landing gear goes
Mhm.
out allows you to focus more on the moment because you know that you've already planned. So it makes a huge psychological difference too to have these things in place, whether you have somebody who have dietary needs, or you're a pilot, or you're a family of four with two kids, and you're planning an outing to a 4th of July parade.
I appreciate you sharing those things. Two things that came to mind as you were talking was that when you plan, you can then prepare, and the act of preparing can be that rehearsal or walking through possibilities. You can then put steps into place to be able to support those needs, which then I think also invites in an opportunity for advocacy. And then when you do have those plans and preparations thought through and put into place, it allows you to have a sense of, I would say, peace of mind when there are moving variables, allows you to stay grounded and present. And I think presence is such an important part of preparedness. Thank you, Jorge. Now that we've talked about how to create a plan that's just right for you, let's think about keeping it ready when you need it the most. So, Jorge, could you share with our listeners, once you've built your communications plan that again is unique for you and your needs, how often should you update it? And also, what is the best way to store it so that it stays safe and easy to access?
Again, let's keep it simple, right? Review it twice a year. Think of it like checking your smoke detector batteries when the clock change, when you do the clock changes twice a year, or at the start of hurricane season, and then when winter season starts. So twice a year, best place to store it so it's handy. I would say, again, plan for contingencies. So store it in multiple places, so physical copy in your go bag, physical copy in your wallet, maybe a physical copy in your glove compartment,
Mm-hmm.
and then the digital stuff in the cloud. I, for example, have a document online as well where I can
Mm-hmm.
access contact information and all of that stuff. So that's for you. For adults, if you have kids, give them a printed version too, as we discussed earlier, and then update the plan when something big happens. So, don't just say, okay, well, we're going to update it twice a year. Let's say you move, you're going to need to update that because that contact that is not in your vicinity or that out of state contact may be too far away now for some reasons. So if you're switching schools or changing phone numbers, the basic stuff. When there are big changes, make sure you update it. And lastly, don't forget about languages. When I write my plan, for example, my mom, who didn't really speak English that well, again, it wouldn't make sense, right? To have a plan that she couldn't understand. So it had to be translated. Again, it has to feel real. It has to fit your reality. It has to be the
Mm-hmm.
right kind of porridge at the right temperature.
I appreciate you sharing. As you were talking, a few things came to mind in the beginning when you said twice a year. I thought about the concept of habit stacking. So, when I think about
Hmm.
preparedness, we want preparedness to not only be a lifestyle and something that you embody, but you can build preparedness habits. And
Yeah.
so, when I say the phrase or speak to the concept of habit stacking, what I mean by that is for those that are not familiar, you take a task that you do every day. So we're going to go with, let's say, brushing your teeth. And then if you want to build a habit, you add that on at the same time that you're doing that original habit. So what does that look like in practice? That looks like after you brush your teeth, you take your vitamins every day. The habit being taking
Um,
a vitamin every day. And
yeah.
so I bring this concept up because when you're building habits, if you have a task or a behavior or a habit that you're doing every day that's consistent and unchanged, and you want to build in a new one, the most successful way or a way to be able to encourage the success that you can be consistent is to add it into the routine of something you're already doing. When we think about preparedness, it's not only a lifestyle, but it's a practice that we're
Yeah.
continuing to embody. And so you said checking your preparedness plan twice a year. When we talk about habit stacking, you talked about when daylight savings time change and the clocks change and you check your smoke detectors,
Right. Right.
adding that in. Okay, so each year I check
Hmm.
my smoke detectors at this time. I can plan for taking a look at my communications plan to seeing if it
Yep.
needs adjustment. And then you talked about changing what is present in those documents as needed or as it's applicable as your circumstances change. And then lastly, having a communications plan in multiple forms, having it accessible in multiple places, right? Like a vehicle, like your home, like your bag, like your wallet, etc. That can be transportable. And I'd also add having multiple parties have access to that same plan. Multiple forms, multiple places, multiple parties
Yep.
is what came to mind for me.
Yeah, very well said.
Okay, so we've talked about what goes into a communications plan, how to make it your own, and when to refresh it. But I think sometimes getting started may feel like a big leap, right? And
Mm,
here at the EPN, and I know Jorge over at MDEM are here for you. So, Jorge, what advice would you share with our listeners who are ready to take that first step in creating a communications plan today or revising one that they already have established?
yeah. As the saying goes, even a 10,000-mile journey begins with
Begin
the
to the
first
first
step,
step.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so again, little, simple, don't get overwhelmed. It doesn't have to be this massively complicated plan. Start simple. In our last podcast, I encourage our listeners, and if they were going to take one step today, right, was to register for MD Ready, right, and to
Yes.
simply either go online or send a text. And we had several do that, which is fantastic. And thank you to you and to your listeners. So again, start simple and build up. Let's start with a couple things. First, write down 3 phone numbers, right?
Mm,
Number one, someone local. Number two, someone out of town. And number three, an emergency service. So this can be
yes.
like a hospital, for example, right? Or a shelter. Another step, if you want to go one step further, talk to your family about when and how to use those contact numbers that you just wrote down. And again, remember, you don't have to have everything figured out today. This is the first step. But even having those things can make a world of a difference. Knowing that you're going to be able to contact these three potential, individuals or entities makes a big step. And taking that first step builds momentum. It's like training for a marathon, right? At first, you're not going to be able to run the entire, 26 miles is it?
Right.
You're going to start small, especially if you're not a runner, right? So
Right.
a little step, then you build on that, then you build on that. It builds momentum. And remember, preparedness is all about progress and forward momentum, right? It's not about perfection. It's about one step at a time, getting a little bit better as every day passes. So that's what I would recommend. Start small. Start with those 3 phone numbers.
Start where you are, do what you can with what you
Hmm.
have. I love that. A phrase that comes to mind for me is incrementable and
Yeah,
implementable. So starting small and in a way that it can be applied. What is something that you can do today that
exactly.
is accessible, that is feasible, even if it's just starting the conversation? Or a step that you've already taken, actually, to our listeners is listening to this, right?
Right.
This is a
Yep.
step toward preparedness because part of preparedness and preparation is being informed. So
Hmm.
learning about how to prepare is a step. So you're already a step ahead, which is a great thing. I wanted to expand on something that you just shared. So you had mentioned as one of the number ones is contact information, right? Who
Hmm.
would need to be added to that list, whether that be local, out of area, et cetera. Who are those people?
Yeah.
And just now you had mentioned emergency services. Think of 3 phone numbers, right? And
Yep.
it's an immediate person, it's somebody out of the area, but emergency
Hmm.
services. So circling back to
Yep.
contact information, it's thinking about accessing emergency services, knowing the contact information in terms of the phone number, but also the location.
Exactly.
And that is incredibly important because you may not always have access to either the most accessible, right, or your preferred emergency services. Say you're traveling,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
What is the
Right.
closest? emergency service. I'm thinking of hospitals, etc., that I could access in the event something were to take place. Many years ago, I was babysitting a friend of the family and their children, and they were traveling out of the country actually. And I stayed with their children before they left. One of the first things that I had asked them was a list. What is your preferred hospital? What is your medical insurance
Yeah.
information? All of the emergency contact phone numbers of the child's school, of the child's pediatrician,
Yeah.
of their pet vet. And I had the parents make me a document, and I'm glad that they did because I actually had to use it, but there was a medical
Hmm.
event. And I'm
Hmm.
glad that I had access to the child's pediatrician and had permissions to be able to be in contact. But I'm glad we had those plans put into place because I had to apply it in a very
Yeah.
quick scenario. All things turned out well, right? But that right there is why it's so important, because we don't want to imagine it, but it's important to prepare for it if that were to take place. It allows you to not only care for yourself, but care for others.
What we talked about last time too is that we have this very human ability to block bad things and not wish to talk about it. That's, I think, what gets in the way of preparedness because we don't want to imagine these scenarios.
Yes.
But I'm here to tell you that if you don't imagine them and they do happen, it's a lot worse. It's a lot worse when they do happen and you have absolutely no plan in place and you have not
Yes.
talked to your family about it and you have not talked to your kids about it and you have not rehearsed it. So, unfortunately, sometimes bad things happen, and it is, I think, just good sense to prepare. Back in the day, we did it instinctively. We prepared for harvest, we prepared for the first
Yes.
frost, and we knew these things. And had we not done that, the frosts would have come and not only wiped out our crops, but potentially wiped us out, right? So we had these preparations, especially if you lived in colder climates. So preparedness is within us. It's an innate part, but
Mm.
somehow we have managed to not want to talk about it because we think that if we don't, then it's not going to happen. And it does happen. So you're better off having this discussion, having your plan. Absolutely.
I appreciate you touching on that being how difficult it is to imagine something you don't want to happen take place.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, I agree with you that a large part of preparedness is the act of imagining. And imagining allows us to think through options, and
Yeah.
options allow us to act. It makes sense to me why resistance comes up in imagining something harmful happening to ourselves or others, because innately we are designed to resist that because our brains are not necessarily designed to make us happy, but they're formed for our survival. I'd love to talk with you, Jorge, about any resources then for our listeners that could support them in creating their communications plan.
There's ready.gov, 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 and they have great templates in English and Spanish. Our own MD Ready system, the app, you can actually go to mdready.maryland.gov and you can find downloadable communication plan cards there as well. And there are also apps from FEMA and the Red Cross that can walk you through plan creation. So whichever tool you use, though, the important thing is that you use it. Like, don't just wait
Yes.
for a disaster or a bad thing to happen to start using it. So take that first step now.
Yes, tools I think are only as effective as they're used. I really appreciate you sharing those resources, and all of which I've accessed myself. But the takeaway for our listeners is no matter the event, there are resources available
Yeah.
to you. And if you are listening and feel like there are not, we as your preparedness partner are here to bridge the gap and break the barriers to be able to get you access to the information and the tools and the resources that you need. And when you have those tools, you can respond in a way that's empowered. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think to wrap this, then, even the most effective plans start with just one conversation at a time. Similarly to the quote that you shared
Hmm.
earlier, the 1,000-step journey or 10,000
Yep.
step journey, I believe might be the quote.
Hmm.
It begins with a single step. And
Yep.
so to our listeners, we're so grateful to you for listening, but we applaud you for having the courage to begin. And so Jorge, as we begin to close our conversation today, do you have any last pieces of advice or words of wisdom to our listeners here?
Yeah, and I'll keep it simple again to close up our theme. Talk about your plan, right? After you write it, talk about it with your family, with that out of state contact person, with your cousin that is your out of state contact. The conversation is just as important as the document itself. Preparedness starts with the people.
Mm,
And the more we normalize talking about emergencies and the more we normalize about having a plan is kind of the cool thing to do, the more resilient our communities become. If it's, a friend, neighbor, anybody in your family, have that 5 minute conversation. Be proud of your plan. Be like, just like we talk about, hey, did you try this new restaurant? Or, ooh, like these are the best shoes I've ever had. They're so comfortable. Have that talk. Be proud of your plan. That one chat you have with your neighbor or a distant family member can save their lives, literally. So that's my closing statement. Talk about your plan and
mm.
practice it.
Preparedness starts with the people. And I love that. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Preparedness in Your Pocket. I hope today's conversation helped you feel more confident about creating a communication plan that truly fits you and your unique needs and those that you love. As your preparedness partner, we want to remind you that whether you're building your plan for the first time or updating your current one, you're not doing it alone. We are here with you every step of the way. And so, Jorge, thank you so much for joining us. It is always a joy to connect with you. Until next time, everyone, stay safe, stay prepared, and take good care. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Preparedness in Your Pocket. This podcast is brought to you by the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network, formed in partnership with the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association and the Office of Preparedness and Response within the Maryland State Health Department. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, Kendal Lee, the EPN's Program Administrator, and edited by Frankie Cirquetti of Storia Studio. Our hope is to meet your curiosity with content that boosts your confidence and strengthens your preparedness. At the EPN, we truly believe that sharing is caring, and so we invite you to subscribe, like our podcast, and share it with friends, family, colleagues, or anyone in the community so that we may all empower each other's preparedness. Please note that the information provided in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to serve as legal or professional advice. While our discussions may include topics and products offered by the participating organizations, listeners should consult with relevant professionals or authorities for specific guidance and recommendations. The views expressed by our guests may reflect those of the hosting organization, though are not intended to replace official advice or guidelines. We can't wait to connect with you again. Until then, stay prepared and take good care.